Why, hello. If you are looking for a panel discussion titled African Diaspora and Intersectionality in Mammalogy, then you're in the right place. And if this isn't what you're looking for, I still hope you stay tuned because we have a treat of the blackest mammalogist people that you may know here today to talk about Blackness in mammalogy and to really dig into the diaspora. So before we get into those definitions, before we get into those people, I first want to introduce myself selfishly. I'm the host, or I'm the moderator. My name is Tyke James. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am based on the traditional land of the Nakachunk peoples, which is Washington, D.C. I do not currently officially study mammals, but I will say I know some really great ones. I'm a mammal. If you're listening to this, you're probably a mammal too. And I always thought that in the metaphor and inspiration of the Avatar, The Last Airbender, birders are airbenders, ichthyologists, the fish people, are waterbenders, herpers are earthbenders, because you got to lift up rocks, and then the mammalogists, they're the firebenders because mammals are warm-blooded. And I will not I will not give all of the facts on mammals. Instead, we have a panel of folks ready to join me, and I would like to welcome them to the stage. Hello, hello, hello. Now, for no other reason than arbitrary familiarity with the English language, I would like for us to go in alphabetical order by last name, reverse. So reverse last name order, we will do the intros, and I believe that would start with you, Christine.
I'm so excited because I am always last. Like growing up, I was always last with the Wilkinson last name. So, hi y'all. I am Christine Wilkinson. My pronouns are she, they, and I am currently talking with y'all from the land of the Chochenyo Ohlone here in Berkeley, California. And I really love mammals, obviously. I am studying a lot of different carnivores right now. And the one that I studied for my dissertation was primarily spotted hyenas, which I'm sure I'll talk more about later on. But I am currently launching into understanding more about carnivores that live right here in my backyard, the Bay Area, California. We're talking coyotes, raccoons, foxes, bobcats. I actually had a dream about a baby bobcat last night. So it's really infiltrating my brain. And I will just leave it there because I will talk more about those carnivores later on when we talk about how we relate to our study species.
Excellent. And Sunny?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jasmine Murphy. I prefer Sunny. I am in a part of Virginia that belongs to the Cherokee people. My pronouns are she, her, and I currently work as a science communicator and content writer for my business, Black Flower Writing Services and Supplies, and I am studying coyotes. We'll always study coyotes now within the context of the intersection between Black and Indigenous North American history and how that kind of intersects with Canada ecology. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I believe Gabby, A-B-E-F. Yeah, Gabby. wait. EFG. I meant, excuse me, Elena. So y'all got to help me out here.
It's okay. It's a lot of letters. Hi, everybody. I'm Elena. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently on the land of the Gayahono people of the Cayuga Nation, so in Ithaca, New York. I am a PhD student at Cornell University in natural resources and the environment. And I guess my mammal is people. So I'm a conservation social scientist, and I look at the gender dimensions of wildlife crime with a specific emphasis on militarized conservation. And I guess the mammals would be mammals in Southern Africa. So great to be here with y'all.
I think I'm next.
Thank you. I was like...
No worries. It's fantastic to be here with you all. My name is Gabby Fleury. My pronouns are they, them. I'm currently in Madison, Wisconsin. I just got here, so I'm on the traditional land of the Ho-Chunk people. And I'm a carnivore biologist, video game designer, author, and technologist. Currently, I'm managing a portfolio of Africa projects for a small NGO. But I'm starting my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison this fall. So my research is going to focus on mitigating carnivore livestock conflict in the Hanze district of Botswana. And my favorite mammal are African wild dogs, otherwise known as painted wolves.
I guess that leaves me. My name is Cesar. I use he, they pronouns. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, also with Christine. I'm coming for you from the Elena people's land. And a lot of my research thinks about how humans in cities influence mammals and what that means for their behavior and their health, and their community dynamics. And how societal inequity underpins all of that. My favorite mammal, I think, are coyotes right now, since that's one of my main focal species, and they're really multifaceted, like Blackness itself, which we'll talk about later.
Oh, I mean, you can moderate the panel, Cesar. You got it. You're getting us started. You already, yeah, and you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. For the sake of the folks that may be new to mammals, maybe they're not new to Blackness, but maybe they're new to mammals. Help us understand, what is a mammal? What is a mammologist? How many O's are in that word? Because I've seen disagreements there. How does one practice mammalogy? Where does it happen? Just help us paint this picture. And in the spirit of still going first on the last name, Christine, could you get us started?
All right, y'all. I feel like this is a test, but so a mammal, for y'all who don't know, they have mammary glands, right? So they create milk out of their mammary glands. They don't always have nipples. Y'all, I'm looking at you, echidnas. And they are warm-blooded. They have fur or hair. And I think the other qualification is that they have a neocortex, but don't quote me on that. And then a mammalogist, which, by the way, like Microsoft Word doesn't like that word, and they correct it to mammologist, which is wrong and can be embarrassing for some. I think someone just told me the story of they were applying to an American Society of Mammalogists grant, and like all of their mammalogists got like corrected to mammalogy, and like it was very embarrassing. And someone like called him on it. So anyway, it is mammalogy. So there is one O, yes, and two A's. Now I'm tripping. And a mammalogist is someone who studies mammals. So that can be anything from like being in the lab, dissecting mammals and seeing how their physiology works and what's going on inside, to, in my opinion, being out on a farm and doing animal husbandry with the mammals that you work with. And I think anything in between. In fact, we were just talking amongst the organizers of Black Mammalogists Week that none of us considered ourselves mammalogists except one person before Black Mammalogists Week. We all just do these intersectional careers and pathways that work with mammals.
Feel free to unmute to add to that. Where do you see yourself in defining what is a mammal and what is a mammologist?
I think it can really take many forms. And I kind of, as Christine was just saying, it can really dig into a lot of different, we're going to be using this word a lot, but a lot of intersectional points of life, because, as even Elena mentioned, like she works with people and focuses on the people side. And at the same time, like you can still be a mammalogist in that, just emphasizing, how do people interact with those mammals? You can be studying mammals in a behavioral sense, in a cognitive sense, in the way that they think. You can be studying it in a space use sense, the spatial ecology. There's a lot of different ways that you can study and work with mammals without even necessarily being an academic, without being maybe a veterinarian, conservationist. It's really very broad and very flexible, what mammalogy really means.
Elena, I saw you go off mute.
Yeah, I was actually really surprised that I was invited to be on this panel, and it kind of made me feel a little bit better when Christine said that no one in Black mammalogists saw themselves as a Black mammologist besides one person. Because I didn't see myself as a mammologist, and I was like, I study people, and I study people's relationships with the environment, with wildlife. So it's interesting that it's developed in this type of way that is more again intersectional and inclusive of like these different dimensions of what scholarship is and what it can be. So it just made me feel a lot nicer.
And Gabby, I saw you wanted to add.
Yeah, actually, so it's been mostly touched upon, but I think also it's helpful to think about, in terms of what does study mean, and how is that, encompassed? Study is not just, the work that is done in the university. It's how, as was mentioned before, how people interact with the environment, community-based, interactions with the environment is equally as important as academic studies of the environment. So I think, mammalogy can actually be done anywhere. And by anyone, which is kind of exciting.
I like that. I like that energy. Now let's. Is there anything you want to add, Cesar? Didn't want to leave you out of the mammologist marathon.
That's what I think I agree. I think with much like any other field or anything that exists, mammalogy is a very dynamic being, and it's super fluid. And what it means to be a mammologist is like ever changing. So I agree with everything.
And maybe the folks at home cannot see this, but Christine put in the chat very aptly, mammalogy-ish. Yeah. I feel that. Now, mammalogy-ish is inspired from a show we all may be familiar with, Black-ish, that talks about blackness, ishness-isms. It's very deep in that way, and it has a lot of layers. And during this Black Mammologist Week, we can look at that word black as a very big word, right? And that it's not just one color or one person or one nationality. What would you like the audience to understand about blackness in this world, and considering that you're not just black, you're black and a mammologist, you're black and who's left-handed here? No left. Okay. All right. Well, maybe that's a different week, whatever. But share what happens in your world, or from your perspective, when these different worlds that you live in, these different identities that contain these different worlds, what's it like when those worlds collide? And maybe Cesar, since you went last, let's see from you, and then we'll go to Gabby.
Yeah, I think kind of like how I was saying, I think just like mammalogy, blackness is so fluid, and I think when it enters a landscape and it starts to exist, I think it really opens up this larger inquiry of interrogation, of theory, of what's actually grounded and realness, and opens up so much possibility. I think that's really important when it enters something that's so fixed like science, because you get to see all these different modes of perception and other routes that weren't seen before. So I think that's kind of what happens when my blackness enters this space, and like my advisors and Christine's and all these folks who are in more urban ecology, and they see a lot more of the roots of what is shaping the landscape that others don't see.
Gabby?
So I'm actually Afrolatinx. My dad is Brazilian, but he's also Black, and that's something that I feel like a lot of people don't know is a thing, that Afrolatinx people exist. So there is kind of that intersectionality there. And one thing that's always really been interesting to me is how Blackness is perceived in different countries, because that's very complex as well. So in Brazil, because so many people are very, very mixed race, very much from very different backgrounds, it's seen differently than in some other countries as well. So I had kind of grown up knowing that my dad was Black, my mom was white, but I never really considered myself as a Black person in the context of the United States until I started getting more into the community and actually meeting people and kind of starting to look at my own background in that way as well. So it's just really fascinating. And then of course it gets complex when you're working in other countries and you're kind of coming in as a foreigner. And I think that's something that we're going to probably chat about later, but it's open for a lot of richness as well, about discussing kind of where those intersectionalities lie, and the complexities that kind of come with that.
Absolutely. And for the person that wants to go next between Christine, Sunny, and Elena, could you also include what we mean when we say diaspora or diaspora, if you feel like it? Go ahead, Jasmine or Sunny.
Yeah, there's so much to get into here. I'll just do a quick, I guess, like timeline of what I feel represents some of my intersectional experiences with mammalogy. But I feel like I have an interesting standpoint because, you know, there's the central line of, you know, me identifying as an African American person. And earlier in my life, I also very much identified as a Christian. And both of those things very much influenced not just how I interacted with wildlife, but how I interacted with the natural world. Because from, you know, when you're an African American, specifically in the United States, African American, but specifically in the United States, you're often met with this idea like, oh, Black people don't like to go outside, Black people don't like animals, and, you know, all these things. So there's that aspect, but then there's the other aspect of when I was a Christian, I very much saw the world so much differently. It was very much, and was my subjective viewpoint, that it was very much a, you know, this world was meant for me, you know, for my enjoyment. This very, not just anthropocentric, but even culture-centric, I think, Western culture-centric viewpoint that I had. And that has very much changed over time, both aspects, I think. As an African-American person, and now that has come from a lot of my own experiences. It's funny, Gabby, that you mentioned that, you know, how you even thought of yourself as Black at certain times in your life, because when I grew up in a rural town in Southern California called Beaumont, and before we moved there, I wasn't even really aware I was Black until people started calling me certain things. And, you know, through time, as I grew up and I started to kind of realize how differently I was treated than other people as a result of being Black. But then, you know, at the end of my undergrad, I was so fortunate to go to Serengeti and study wildebeest, where my Blackness was perceived differently than it was in the States, in Tanzania and in Kenya. And I was so confused at how celebrated my Blackness was. And it was just so interesting. And the dynamics, because the people that I was working with at the time, some of them were white. And so you could see the different dynamics there. It's just also interesting. And yeah, so I think just to kind of close that all together, there these identities. Oh, and I also wanted to touch on what you said, Cesar, about science being fixed, because I think that's a very Western viewpoint, because science, and you've already said that science is just so fluid. The study itself is so fluid. The practice itself is fluid. And it really, you know, when we talk about, you know, the different viewpoints, and even taking from Indigenous viewpoints and how it's seen as very place-based, it's seen as moving through life with you. There's just so many different perspectives and so much fluidity within Blackness itself, within indigeneity, within the diaspora, which I will close with. The fundamental definition of being a member of a diaspora, in this case, the African diaspora, is being someone who is descended from a people that originated from, in our case, the African continent. And so you can have the African American diaspora, you can have the Haitian diaspora, you can have the Brazilian diaspora. So yeah, it's really beautiful, and like some of you have already mentioned, that the richness is just unfathomable in all of these different perspectives. So I'll stop rambling.
That was great, Sunny. Thank you so much. Christine?
Yeah, that was excellent. There are so many points that y'all touched on that resonate with me. And I just want to kind of touch on what Gabby and Cesar were saying. So Gabby, I'm also a mixed race person. My mom is Black and my dad was white. And so I grew up in New York City, straddling these spaces without really thinking much of it. the only times I would think about it were when people in my peer groups would like say, I'm not Black enough or I'm not white enough. And I never really felt like I fit in anywhere. In fact, I wrote a blog post semi-recently about how I should just make the country of Africa, and then like me and Obama and Steph Curry can move there or whatever. But like at the same time as it sort of being this, I don't really feel like I belong anywhere thing, I do recognize that it also gives me positions of privilege, right? Like where I'm able to code switch and navigate spaces in different ways than folks in either group can, both as far as like my skin color and like those aspects of privilege, but also as far as like having maybe a more fluid viewpoint of the world, which I think influences the fluidity and the broad philosophical perspectives I bring to my science. And so, also touching on what you were saying about going to other countries, I've done a lot of my work in East Africa, most recently a lot of work in Kenya, and was actually the very first time I went to Kenya, I was very excited to finally be in a place where everyone was Black and like that was celebrated, because I had like more often than not, the white spaces were the ones that were exoticizing me and making me feel, you know, left out in all of these different ways. But when I arrived, of course, I was and still am, with people who don't know me, perceived as kind of a white foreigner, right? So like, again, like being called Muzungu, which is foreigner, but it's also usually applied to white people that have like a lot of money, perceived to have lots of money, which like usually I haven't been in that position, like been more, I'm from a low socioeconomic background, et cetera, really kind of devastated me. And it's been taking a lot of my journey to work through that and realize, okay, even though I'm perceived this way by people who don't know me, there's still a lot of blessings here in that I can use this identity of mine, this mixed identity, to do better interdisciplinary science and to do science that bridges across different communities that I work with in Kenya, in ways that I think I have the ability to more deeply listen to different groups of people, because I know what it's like to not be listened to. I know what it's like to not belong. And I also just have an inherent relation to a lot of these groups of folks. So I think it has helped my science to be better and more fluid and less rigid when I'm doing this sort of interdisciplinary human-wildlife conflict work.
Thank you for that, Elena. And I want you to feel free to add on to that conversation about the diaspora. But I also want to see if you can kind of lean into the next topic I want to bring us to. And this is an especially interesting point of view, I think, that can come from you, because you're mammal, you see every day. You look in the mirror and you're like, oh, there they go. And so I would love to see, or love to hear, how does your approach to mammalogy connect to your sense of self?
Okay, that's a really good question. I am also mixed. My mom is white and then my dad's Black. And it took me a while to kind of understand the connections between my identity and my research. I think I was trying to keep it separate because that's what I'd been exposed to and seen a lot of the times. And I actually initially wanted to go to veterinary school. So I had no interest in research until I started working with, her name's Dr. Meredith Gore, in wildlife crime. And I became completely enamored with the subject. And I also became interested in my identity as a woman and as a feminist, and how that integrated into my work with wildlife crime and how we're able to evaluate the people who are affected by it, and these types of relationships that go beyond just like humans and wildlife, but have these really intricate intersections with gender and sexuality and race. And now I am trying to find a way to integrate like my own morals regarding like feminism, social justice, and Blackness within my research, because I think it's a really integral component that hasn't been investigated as much. So I guess kind of leaning into this kind of like blurred line between identity and scholarship in a way that I think is more reflective of what the world is and how I perceive it, and how I see myself in making a change that is something that I would want to see for myself.
Thank you for that. And going around the panel here, folks that want to add on, how do you see yourself in your approach to mammalogy, whether it's your study species or whether, yeah, as Elena really well pointed out, like just through your scholarship?
I like to take a community-based approach first. So kind of the first thing that I do, I also work kind of similar to what Christine does in the very kind of human-wildlife interface space. And I always approach my research as what's most helpful for communities, and trying to approach it from that first. So before I even do, design a project, I like to kind of get a sense of what's the data that's missing that could be applied directly within that community to mitigate conflict or to be helpful in some way. And also I think very strongly about, sustainability. So once I leave the area, I don't want to just go in, do my research and leave. So how can I make sure that what the results of my study are can be distributed in a way that's helpful, but also that can help long term. So making those relationships with on the ground, organizations who are going to be there a long time or long-term programs is really important to me. So I think kind of having that kind of community first attitude is kind of the leading thing behind most of my work.
Thank you. Folks want to add on?
Yeah, I think it's another kind of big picture thing, but it really goes along with what both of you are saying here, is not only exploring and learning yourself, but also your community. My whole thing within pretty much this last maybe year, maybe a little bit more, has been really putting information in the hands of the people by letting them know, like kind of guiding them towards a better, more functional understanding of their belonging in the natural world. And what I mean by that is understanding where we came from in the first place. And two of the questions that kind of really brought me here is one of the first questions I ever asked when I first started studying coyotes in my master's program was like, okay, why do people hate coyotes so much? Why in the world do we hate coyotes so much? That simple question will take you down such a huge rabbit hole, like this never-ending rabbit hole of European settlements, of just wiping out indigenous cultures, indigenous practices. And then, you get to another question, why based on the stereotype, obviously, why don't Black people like going outside? Okay, well, it's clearly a stereotype, but why does that stereotype exist? You go back and you look at Jim Crow era segregation, and you look at how we weren't even allowed to enjoy natural spaces without the threat of lynching, without the threat of jail time. Earlier in earlier years, I believe this was in the kind of the Reconstruction era, probably a little later, I might be wrong. But a lot of times when Black people would get jailed, there was I forget the term for it, but there was the very real risk that they would be basically put back into bondage. So there's some real trauma underlying a lot of ecological studies, a lot of mammalogy. And I think that's kind of what got me down this path of like exploring what it means to learn my sense of self within the context of mammalogy, and what it even means to be a mammalogist that can enact meaningful change. Because I don't think that we can. You mentioned sustainability, Gabby, and I think that understanding who and where we are and where we came from is key to that sustainability. Because if we don't know what caused the issues that we have now, we can't fix them. We just can't. And so I think really understand this journey towards understanding my sense of self within mammalogy is kind of dealing with that history, and dealing with how that history has shaped our management practices, because there's a lot of excessive lethal management of coyotes, and that there are huge historical reasons as to why. It shapes a lot. It really shapes a lot. And I think I don't have a definitive answer as to what my identity within the context of mammalogy is, because it's something I'm still very much learning. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention that framing.
And before we hear from Christine and Cesar, I want to just quick ask, is your, just like by the nodding or the shaking of the head, is your approach to mammalogy similar to your approach to communicating science? Something to think about. Okay, Christine. I saw you went off mute.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sunny. That was all really helpful. And I really resonate as someone who studies spotted hyenas, which is another very widely reviled animal. When thinking about like I've been reflecting on how my identities kind of interact with or are paralleled in my study species. And I was thinking, wow, I've really studied a lot of misunderstood and reviled animals. So like I've studied herring gulls, right? Like everyone calls gulls the trash bird. I've studied spotted hyenas. I'm now launching into raccoons and coyotes. And the things that drew me to those animals wasn't like, oh, these animals are like me. It's those animals, the ones that are the most reviled are usually the ones that are the most adaptable to the hardships that humans place upon them. So, you know, the animals that are generalists that can kind of make it in some way, whether they're thriving or not, they're definitely surviving in spaces that have been severely altered by people, both neutrally, right, or in really awful ways. And so we come into closer contact with those animals and then they become reviled. And again, you know, in reflecting on the types of relationships that African Americans have had with white folks in this country and with green space in this country, and these animals that are generalists and adaptable, what you see in some of the, say, the posts on Nextdoor or these other social media posts is the rich, kind of often white folks near these green spaces are the ones that are like, oh my God, these coyotes are going to eat my cat and I don't want them here. We need to get them out. And so it's still paralleled in this way. And then slightly separately getting at what you were saying about the stereotype of Black people not liking to be outdoors and the histories of where that stereotype came from are these very real spaces and zoning and laws, right? Like we look at redlining and all the green space that's taken away and replaced by industry in cities. And so Black people don't have access to green space, right? You look at things like Jim Crow affecting who gets to swim in swimming pools, right? My mom never knew how to swim. She still doesn't. And I was taught how to swim by some folks that we met when I was like 8 in Virginia. And I spent like a lot of my childhood trying to teach my mom how to swim, who's, as I said, Black, and she never learned how to swim. Whether or not it came from that era, I never asked her, but I don't think that it's a coincidence. She also we never went hiking or camping or anything as a kid. And I think that all of that is from this legacy that you're talking about. And so it's something that I think maybe several of us here have had to overcome that legacy or those stereotypes or both to bust into these fields that are related to mammalogy.
Yeah, and Cesar, I see you wanted to add something.
Yeah, so I guess I'm going based off just thinking about like reflection of species into my identity as a mammologist. And I think, so I think a couple things. I feel like there's so many routes I want to go, and I'm sorry if I ramble. But so this semester I was fortunate to take a queer ecology class, and there are a couple of questions that have really, or quotes that have stuck with me. And so one, Mel Chen has this book called Animacies, where they discuss this hierarchy of the human and the animal and this fixed hierarchy, how there's so much slippage between these terms. As we know, if you look at the history of Blackness, right, of Blackness and Black people being treated as animals and things like that. So a question that has stuck with me from one of the chapters is what happens when an animal appears in the landscape? And another quote that's really great from Donna Haraway is, you know, what happens when we leave human exceptionalism and bounded individualism? What happens when we discard that out of philosophy and science and becomes absolutely unthinkable and you don't think with that at all? What does that mean? And so I feel like I've been walking through that a lot this semester. And what does that mean to try to tether that to my own research? And if we kind of go back, I think with the coyote, I think coyotes are really special, just like a lot of mesocarnivores. In the city, right? They persist and then they show up and they, like Christine said, they're super, super adaptable in these spaces that weren't really built for them at all. And even though they adapt and they persist, they're demonized, even though they're super beautiful and meek. And so I've been thinking, like, what does that mean for me as a Black queer man in academia, where it's not built for me? Similar to the coyote, right? Like Christine's talking about, super adaptable. You have to be super plastic and bend constantly. And so I think I've been thinking a lot about that and how what Sunny was talking about, like, why do people hate coyotes? Why are terms like criminal and not belonging and a pest, why is that attached to the coyote and fixated? And why does that feel so tethered to myself and my identity in these spaces? So I feel like that's kind of things I've been walking through. And also I think it maybe helps the research a bit by like blurring this boundary between like myself as above and the coyote and all these animals below. And I'm discovering things about them rather than them just showing me more about their biology. Yeah, I think that's like stuff I've been trying to sit on a lot. Yeah.
That's awesome. And very insightful all around. A new remix to a Black Beatles song came out recently with the lyrics, "Carnivores in the city will be back immediately to confiscate the rabies." And that is in reference to some of the foxes that have been around DC, not silver fox, red fox, city, regular old foxes that have, in some words, run amok, caused a bit of a stir, maybe ruffled a few feathers. R.I.P. to the flamingos at the Smithsonian Zoo. A fox on Capitol Hill bit 9 people. That's where we pass laws. And now there's passing of potential rabies. I understand the fox was euthanized and they euthanized the kit. And for some people, that was a really great end of the story. I would love to hear from this group. When you think about that human wildlife conflict, when you think about wildlife crime, I like that concept. How do you reflect on these type of stories? Yes, it's not a coyote this time it's a fox, but just give me some of your thoughts on what that means to you and how science communication plays a role in some of this.
You want to go first?
You can go first. It's fine.
Okay. I have a lot to say about this. But okay, so one of the first things that always comes to mind with these kinds of stories is I completely understand and at times agree with the necessity of lethal control. I understand the need for it at times. In this case, the fox, I didn't see the full story, but the fact that the fox bit 9 people showed me that it was probably going. Now, that being said, I think that there are a lot of times when human beings behave in ways that aggravate human-wildlife conflict and they don't know it. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people tend to follow the whole thinking of like, oh, look at this cute little fox. I'm gonna just give it a piece of bread, or I'll just try to pet it real quick or something like that. And I think that very much comes from this mindset of anthropocentrism and thinking everything is for us to enjoy. All these animals are nice little critters from the freaking Sleeping Beauty, and they all just want to come and hang out with us when we sing. And that's just not the case. I think that people, and this is part of what I want to do in the things that I'm studying, but I think that we're at a point where it is essential to our persistence as human beings, but also essential to other species' persistence, that we really get a grip and understand how we're impacting the environment around us. We can't afford anymore to live in a bubble and keep pretending like our actions are in a vacuum. We need to understand that when we feed wildlife, when we try to interact with them, when we refuse to engage in humane deterrent behaviors. And I mean, in a sense of, I might be getting the term wrong here. I might be confusing the term here, but hazing, when you make a lot of noise, maybe throw some things in the general direction of the animal just to scare it off and teach it in a non-violent way. You shouldn't be around us, basically. There was a study a couple of years ago where a couple of scientists researched whether people could make the connection between their behavior and the animal's behavior. And they just would not make the connection, even after losing a couple of pets in some cases. they could not make the connection between this is what my behavior is causing and this is how the animal is responding. It was always the animal's fault in their minds. And Christine, how you mentioned earlier with the neighborhoods which are a little bit more affluent, those in that same study were determined to be the ones who are quicker to call the police, who are not trained to deal with wildlife, who are trained only to deal with things in a lethal manner. So it's just this really terrible feedback loop. And so whenever I see these stories, and I've been seeing a couple of them come up too with coyote attacks. Whenever I think of these stories, I immediately wonder what the people were doing in the years before that and how they were interacting with the animals. What could have been done differently in this case? In the case of the fox, I think really that was the only way out. But in other cases, I think we really need to step back and I don't think that we can continue much longer without really recognizing that this is how we impact wildlife. And I think we really need to start taking some responsibility for that.
We're going to go Gabby, then Christine, and then Cesar has a quote that he wants to share. But Elena, you're not out of this conversation either. You're going to get some of this fox, so don't you worry. Feel free, Gabby.
Yeah, so I really, that resonates with me, Sunny, all of what you said. I do think that one thing to kind of take into consideration is that perception of wildlife equals reality as to the outcome of what happens with that wildlife. So I think a lot of it also ties back to education and people not understanding kind of how wildlife function or about the species or about their natural behavior. And kind of, as you mentioned, Sunny, kind of projecting ideas of what that might be onto the species itself, or taking kind of cues from media as to expectations of how that species might react, and then kind of almost trying to get ahead of things, right? To kind of cut things off in a very kind of negative to the actual wildlife way. So I think that's the big challenge is how do you speak to people and get them engaged in wildlife, be able to see them in this different light? Because I do think, it also kind of ties down to kind of separation of people and wildlife. If people aren't used to seeing animals around, when they do see one, they might react, in a really negative way because they're not used to them, right? You aren't around them. They don't really understand their natural behaviors, and they might actually read those natural behaviors as a threat or as something dangerous to them when it's not intended to be. So I think a lot of it is how do you bridge that gap between people and wildlife when they have been separated out or when people have not been interacting with them.
Thank you, Christine.
I want to hark back to what Sunny was talking about with people feeding wildlife, just 'cause it's very close to my heart right now. I've been working through the San Francisco Animal Care and Control Coyote Sightings database. And what you see, before they actually lethally controlled, I believe, this coyote, there was a coyote that was trying to attack toddlers by the throat in the middle of the day in Golden Gate Park. And it was just like one coyote, right? But if you hear about that once, you're scared of all coyotes, right? And then if you look parallel to that, last year, we had some news about a woman going around San Francisco and hand feeding coyotes meat. Okay. And so what you see there is this great irony that's just one illustration of, which is we have as people separated ourselves from nature and tried to make ourselves separate from nature for generations and generations. But what that then leads to is we want to reconnect, right? And you see this in people like Tiger King or people like on the internet taking pictures with baby things that then later get killed because they get too big, and feeding. And that's like an ego feed. Like if you think about it, the next best thing to getting a picture with Beyonce is getting a picture with a liger, with your arms around. And it's very weird that they are equivalent things for your ego. But I believe that it harks back to us wanting to reconnect with animals and with nature because we have disconnected ourselves. But then if we reconnect like that, especially in the wild, it leads to things like toddlers being attacked in Golden Gate Park, lethal control, perceptions changing, and then that changing the way that people interact with these animals. And we enter that negative feedback loop. So the question that guides a lot of my work is, how do we look at all of these perceptions, all of these disconnections, all of these elements and wildlife behavior and get to a place of coexistence where we're not pushing that pendulum so far in either direction? So that's what guides my work.
Thank you for that. Cesar, you want to set up this quote you wanted to share in the chat, I see.
Yeah, I think I have too much fleshed out, but I think as Jasmine and Gabby and everyone was talking, I think a great quote that Neil Ahuja, who's at University of Santa Cruz, I believe, has in one of his essays is, as a human who's an organic imperialist, he colonizes ecologies, time, and thought. And so this idea that Jasmine's hitting, right, like this idea that we kind of are owed nature, like nature owes us things, and we get to do these things to it because we are above it. Yeah, and I think I've also been sitting on, like, since I've met Christine, one thing that Christine's always said is, like, it's not human-wildlife conflict, it's human-human conflict. And how a lot of this is all one-sided, which is everyone's already touched on, right? Like hand feeding, all these things. And a lot of my work thinks about where are these risk-prone behaviors occurring on the landscape and what's underpinning it, and what does that mean for coexistence? And so I'm trying to, like, especially this semester, move away from the word conflict because it maps, I think, a lot of aggression onto animals. It makes them a lot more antagonistic than they actually are, because we're like curating this personality for the animal by hand feeding them meat and things like that, where when they snap out, it's like, oh, that was personal, even though we cleared this entire forest and put up buildings, and now animals want to show up, and that's conflict because they're just coming back to where they've always been. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's like this whole idea of fictitious conflict that I'm also working through.
And Elena, last, not even least, this is the penultimate topic before we hear from questions from our audience. Could you elucidate on how, if we were to consider it this way, Beyonce would be the Ligers of humans, being both a person but then also godly in some way? So you want to go into that at all, or you can also share more generally your thoughts on that idea of conflict, human, wildlife, what
So I hope there is a Beyonce Liger, but I also hope there isn't. Don't want any more Ligers, but do want Beyonce. I think that's a good testament that we can all agree with.
I can agree with that.
Another thing that was it was kind of dumb, but I was wondering, like, how this fox bit 9 people, like, were they all standing in a row? Was it just like chomp, chomp, chomp? But in actuality, I was thinking more about like who was bitten and what they were doing, like a lot of you were thinking as well, because I wonder if these people were in a predominantly Black area, like, would have been resolved as quickly. What would have happened had this occurred somewhere else where it's far removed from, like, the United States? Like, how we manage, like, human wildlife conflict in the States is dependent on, like, geography, on racial demographics, and it's very different here, and it's even more different in other countries, and how prevalent, like, Blackness is in these types of areas. So just having these, like, racialized and gendered dimensions to how we talk about and how we approach conversations with human wildlife conflict, I think, is really important in these types of discussions, and in how like conservationists or policymakers are addressing these types of issues, because it's more than just like human wildlife. It's about the dimensions of being a human and what wildlife is involved.
And thank you for that. Now we're getting closer to the end here, and I want to hear again from Christine on just this topic, because now we're kind of going free form on just like mammals in the world, because we also live in this world, and so we're trying to define things and navigate things. So provide a little bit more insight for us, Christine.
Wait, insight on what? Sorry. Exactly about mammals.
So mammalogy is like this study, but also there's just like outdoor recreationalists. There's people like me who watch birds, and every now and then I'll see a groundhog and I'll be like, oh, there goes those mammals taking up all the attention again. But help us understand what position, what context we're in as we're interacting with this wildlife.
Sure. Yeah. So for me, the reason that I find people who study, or even mammal enthusiasts, so important for this world and also for conservation in general of all species is because, as we know, we are mammals. So we are most closely related to the wild mammals that we're seeing around us. And because of the way that they look and the way that, often their cute little eyes are centered, on their face, like there's a whole psychology around how we are connected to species that are looking a little bit more similar to us. And so if we're able to use, although yes, mammals are usually the ones that are like our charismatic megafauna, like the ones that are, bringing people to flock to the zoos, despite the importance of other species, bird species, reptile species, etc., they can really be these sort of bastions of conservation that led us to personally connect and understand the broader conservation issues in a more personal way and in a more emotional and empathetic way than some people can connect with a snake, which, by the way, I love snakes, so don't worry. But not everyone can connect with them because they don't feel that automatic, we're similar, we're closely related, you look sort of like a baby, that kind of thing. So we can use them as kind of these jumping off points into broader conversations about conservation and into connecting more varied and more diverse communities with conservation, in my opinion.
Thank you. On the topic of conservation, I just want to add, as we are landing this plane, a new scientific report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Diversity and Ecosystem Services estimates 1 million plant and animal species could be headed towards extinction in the coming decades, more than any other time in human history. What is a top issue facing mammals today that your work is addressing? And how is your work relevant to the folks who don't know those facts that I just laid out? And I know we only have 8 minutes left, and you're probably answering that question as we speak because that's part of what you're studying. So feel free to know that this is not a finite or an exhaustive answer for the folks at home. And be sure to follow all of the folks here in Black Mammologist Week, because part of this existence is answering that question. And so in the spirit of how we started, let us go in alphabetical order with first names. It's all you, Elena, excuse me.
No worries. I think the way that I think about it is I study wildlife crime, so it's a lot of death, to be honest. It's a lot of natural resource extraction. But from this, I think I'm a chronic optimist, and I think that there is possibilities for change. It's just kind of recognizing what the true root of these types of problems are. For the majority of wildlife crime, I focus on poaching and trafficking, but the main people who are involved are people who need extra income or are needing to fulfill some kind of nutritional deficiency or something that's related to a broader social issue. So when it comes to these types of numbers that say oh, all this wildlife is going to be gone, it's discrediting these underlying social problems that are leading to overwhelming natural resource use or overwhelming human wildlife conflict incidences as people are being pushed into the areas where wildlife were or are deciding to be because they don't have another choice. So I think when I think about this, I tend to think more positively. And if we're able to kind of understand these linkages between the environment and justice and what that can mean for conservation or for mammalogy, we might be more successful in reducing those numbers or not making it a tangible future.
Right. And I am pressed. Here we are, 5 minutes left, and I don't think we have enough time to get the answers to the world. But I definitely want to leave time to let the good folks listening know what else is happening with Black Mammologist Week. And with the 5 minutes that we have, Sunny, Cesar, Gabby, do you think you can do 45 seconds to tell us what can we do to save the mammals? What are you doing to save the mammals? Starting with Sunny.
Okay, what am I doing to save the mammals? What I'm doing to save the mammals is, again, really putting quality information in the hands of the people and making sure you're not excluded because you're not in academia. You're not excluded because you're not, any of the other, job titles or academic titles, anything like that. You're not excluded. You are entitled to the information that we have. You're entitled to the same information because it affects your day-to-day life. I would really challenge everybody to please think about, switching your mindset. Think of mammals, non-human organisms, as your neighbors, not as animals, because you're an animal too. And you don't get to separate yourself because of, intellect or reason or anything like that, because many of them have the same cognitive abilities that you do. So I would really challenge you, get your hands on information that can teach you where you are, you're belonging in the natural world. Think of animals as your neighbors and not as just an animal. So, yeah.
Thank you, Cesar.
Yeah, so I'm an urban ecologist technically, and I think one of the things that I'm doing at Save Mammals is like thinking about how, as we expand with cities, how can we treat cities like another ecosystem? We talk about boreal forests, grasslands, et cetera, et cetera. What does it mean to build a healthy city that can actually sustain itself as an ecosystem and be this micro habitat and this larger habitat for mammals, birds, and all other things? So yeah, I think that's a lot I think of. What is a healthy city? What does that mean for not only the people, but the wildlife inhabiting it?
Thank you. Gabby?
So I'm working a lot with people is the way that I save mammals. So also trying to kind of come into a system without as much as possible preconceptions and biases, trying to understand the reasoning behind why people might feel antipathies towards specific species, and also understanding that there are impacts to people's livelihoods and the reason why people might not, like certain species as well. So not only just kind of looking at it from that lens, but also kind of understanding that as a foreign researcher, having to approach it in a very particular way. So looking at it in terms of that kind of avoiding trying to tell other people how to do conservation, understand kind of what the underlying factors are behind problems.
Thank you so much. I am so mammal woke right now. And Christine, I really want you to knock it out of the park. What can we do to stay mammal woke? How can we save them?
All right, y'all. I like to think of myself as saving the connections that we have with mammals, with our fellow mammals, right? So saving and building those connections. Just like all of you, I think I use a lot of the same tools that you do, working with people, listening to people, and really lifting up the people that are doing that work to involve communities and boost livelihoods while working on saving our mammal species. And so I do want to leave you with what you can do to get involved in Black Mammologist Week toward that end. We do have a scholarship that we are fundraising for called the Black and Indigenous Scholars Award in Mammalogy. We created a few years ago, and our big push fundraiser right now is through selling these really dope shirts and sweatshirts and tank tops. They're only being sold through May 8th. You can buy a shirt, you can donate extra if you want to. All of it goes right to the endowment for that scholarship, which will be administered in perpetuity 2 times a year. We're about to announce the first winner of that scholarship tomorrow. So we're very excited about that. And we really think that, Black Mammologist Week is all about not just building community and finding who's out there and working together with other Black and Indigenous mammalogists, but it's also about tangibly supporting and building up that community so that we can do more good, and we can do more good from these intersectional perspectives and experiences that we've had that makes science more equitable, more accessible, and more people-centered. So that's what I'd like to leave you with.
And thank you for that. Thank you all for participating. Shake your hands, make some noise. The good people listening, wherever you are, thank you for making Black Mammologist Week special. Thank you for waking me up to the mammals, because boy, now I want to go see some things that are that have mammary glands, that are warm-blooded with fur and hair, to be specific about my new mammal love. So thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thanks,
We
y'all.
appreciate you.
Hit us up on Twitter.